Host of our webinar today. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting and Aboriginal people's connection with the land on which we're on and the impacts of colonialisation. I'm on Gadigal Wungal land, and wherever you may be joining us from, I recognise this as Aboriginal land and welcome any Aboriginal people here today. The community of policy professionals is for New South Wales public sector employees working in any policy-related role. Today's webinar showcases a new resource and tool to improve understanding of the sometimes complex relationships between legislation. Matthew Roberts is the Director of the Analytics Practice and Capability group at the New South Wales Data Analytics Centre. Originally, he trained as a physicist and he has 20 years experience in the public sector at Commonwealth and state levels, and he's worked at the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, the Taxation Office, the Department of Family and Community Services in a range of roles working with data and using analysis to shape compliance, public awareness and workforce planning. At the Data Analytics Centre, he is responsible for managing a team of data scientists and analysts who work with the New South Wales public sector agencies to address challenging issues, cross-agency strategies and wicked policy problems. He is joined by Jordan Finch, Principal Data Scientist at the New South Wales Data Analytics Centre, who has led the development of the New South Wales legislation twin. Thank you, Matthew and Jordan, for joining us today. I'll pass over to you now for the presentation, and we'll follow up with a question and answer session. And I'll note in the chat how audience members can participate in that once we get underway. Thanks very much. I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you, Louisa. And thanks for having me this morning. This is a very great audience to be showing this tool to. Unfortunately, Jordan can't join us today. He's had a personal emergency, but I've had enough practice at this, so I think we'll be all right. Just a word on the Data Analytics Centre. So we're part of the Department of Customer Service, but we do work across government. So our role is to provide data science support to agencies across government, and we've worked with certainly most of the clusters, almost all of the clusters, I think now, on different projects over the last 5 or 7 years. We have been doing a lot of work over the last 2 years in particular with what we call natural language processing and the text analytics, which of course has become a very big thing this year with the release of ChatGPT and the other generative AI models. And we have actually used elements of that in the tool we're going to show you. As Louisa said, what this tool is designed to do, and we think it has quite a broad relevance, hopefully particularly to this group. What we're trying to do with this is help you get more visibility over the connections between legislation and regulations and gazettes even, to make it easier to search and visualize some of the questions that come up when you need to look at review of legislation, new policies and the context they sit in, or new regulations. So I will show the tool. What I'm going to do today is just step you through the different elements of the tool, and we'll leave time for questions. When you go into the tool, you'll see just an About tab. We have a range of guides here which talk to each of the tabs that just give you a sense of how you can use them. So you don't need to take notes. Hopefully you'd be able to go in and just use this. Just a quick note on the data we're using here. What we're presenting here is, for the most part, is current in-force legislation. So we're not looking at the historical picture at this stage, and that's updated every day. We have also drawn on the historical gazettes for the last 20 years, I think. They're not yet updated quite as frequently. So I'll start off with the cross-references tab. And this just allows you to pick a piece of legislation or a subordinate instrument. We like to use the Partnership Act. You can see we've got acts, regulations, and environmental planning orders ticked here. And the perils of a live demonstration. Oh, there we go. Now I've just reset it. Okay. So what you can see in the middle is the Partnership Act. And to the left of that, the Decimal Currency Act, the Interpretation Act, we can see by the direction of the arrow that these are acts that are referenced in the Partnership Act. And on the right, we have a series of acts and regulations that reference the Partnership Act. So if I click on the arrow, pardon me, if I click on the arrow joining the Partnership Act and the Duties Act, then what I'll see come up is a text box which contains the text where the Partnership Act is referenced in the Duties Act. And it is running a little slowly this morning. It seems we have some other users at the moment. Okay, let me try another tab. Okay, beg your pardon. It is running a bit slowly. We might come back to that one. I'll just move to the search tab. And this is where we've introduced our first piece of AI. So we've introduced some semantic search here. So if we just use this are related to this topic search query, we can go beyond the kind of specific text searches that you're used to, for instance, with the New South Wales legislation site itself. So we search on powers of entry, and for instance, we can restrict it to legislation administered by the Minister for Better Regulation and Fair Trading. And that brings up 50 pieces of legislation. And what I think I want to show you here is that, of course, we are seeing sections in the legislation about powers of entry, so very much the exact text. But we start to see variations as well. So we've got powers of authorised officers to enter premises, the use of force, intriguingly contained in the Plumbing and Drainage Act, and so on. Now this table is downloadable. That'll just come through as an Excel file. And this is actually a specific use case that was raised with us by the policy team in the Better Regulation Division, where they're concerned to understand, well, what are the different powers of entry for different arms of the business? when they're making changes, when they're introducing new policies, it's really helpful to understand what that context, what's consistent, what's the range of powers that exist. And of course, you can do exact searches as well. So contains any of these phrases, contains all of the words or phrases, does not contain, and so on, the kind of functionality you're used to. I'll go back to the cross-references tab. So let's try to click on this link between the Duties Act and the Partnership Act again. Just while we're waiting for that to come up, you'll notice on the left, we see checkboxes for Minister. So if we click on these, what we'll see is a blue circle appear around the pieces of legislation administered by whichever minister we select. So you can get a picture of, okay, well, these acts are all connected. Who are the relevant ministers? That's actually updated from the allocation orders. Come back to that when it's run. I'll move to the definitions tab, and here we're searching the definitions section of all the definition sections of pieces of legislation. Now, what I need to do here is wait for the term to actually appear. Yes, you'll notice that was an error message, so we'll just proceed. This network can be expanded out. So if I click on one of these other pieces of legislation, I can extend this network to say, okay, well, show me the pieces of legislation that also reference the Duties Act, for instance. One of the other things we can do here, which hopefully I'll get to actually show you, is select the gazettes. And what this will do is bring in all of the gazettes that reference a particular piece of legislation. If you've had to work with gazettes, you'll know that they're PDF documents. They're difficult to work with and borderline unsearchable. And they are a bit of a problem to work with. What we've done there is our second use of AI, and it's actually using that generative AI capacity. We've generated titles for each gazette and 100-word summaries for each gazette. So when you click on a gazette in this, it's actually going to show you that title and that summary of the gazette. So you can see, is it a total fire ban? Is it renaming some roads? Is it an energy regulation? Okay. Let me see if I can demonstrate that. Perhaps not. Okay, we'll go across to something a little simpler. So the Ministerial Act allocations, this is really just a visualization of the administrative orders, but we can it's just a nice representation of where those where the ministers have sole responsibility and where they're sharing the responsibility. And again, what you can do there is click on the arrows, and it will bring up a text box to show you, look, they administer, the entire legislation, or they administer this act except for section 3 and 6 or whatever it might be. We have a government map tab, beg your pardon, government map tab. At this stage, that's really just showing the highest levels of the structures and the agencies that are specifically set out in the schedule to the Government Sector Employment Act. What we're hoping to do in the longer term is flesh that out with the many other entities that exist. And I'll back to this. I was testing this morning, and we were working well. Okay.
Matthew, we did have a suggestion from the audience that sometimes when sharing websites, it can create some lag. So we understand that that there are always things that happen in the background that are not expected. And we do have plenty of questions, so we're happy to.
Let's go to them.
We can
Yes.
start answering some questions, perhaps, and while we wait for things to load. Actually, I might start with, there's a couple of unknown users, but how about we start with, is it Tanja Zek? Could you come on and ask your question, please?
Sure. Hello. Thanks. It looks like a fabulous, very useful tool that you're presenting here when it works. I was just wondering, what is the underlying data set? Like, is this drawing on legislation New South Wales, or is it anything else?
Yes, it's legislation New South Wales. Entirely. Well, awesome. I say entirely. The exception is the Gazette summaries, where it's legislation New South Wales, but sort of secondhand, where we've generated that summary text ourselves, but it's obviously working with legislation New South Wales.
And we also have a question from the audience. Apologies, I don't know who's asking this question, but does it cross-reference Commonwealth government instruments as well?
Not at this stage, no. So I guess one of the things I'll just call out is we do have a feedback tab here. So as you do go away and start to play with this and use it, we're very keen to get feedback on your experience with it. And part of that is, look, where is it working well for you? How is it helping? But also we'd like to know where would you like to see it extended? So certainly that's a potential area we can move to.
Great. And is it Ali Guzman? Would you like to come on and ask your question? Please also say where you're from, so we get to know more people from our community of practice. I think the question is, are there plans to include?
I'm sorry.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
I'm
can hear you.
I'm from iCare, and I think the question is if there is any plans to include bills or speeches or memorand or explanatory notes in this wonderful tool.
So I think it's look, we haven't actually considered explanatory memorandum or bills before, but in principle we could move towards that, yes. I think one of the other things that we have considered is I suppose a more strategic level analytics piece, which would align more with a paper that the Productivity Commission put out a few years ago, where the interest is in looking at, how is the system, for lack of a better word, changing over time in terms of, for instance, the number of regulations, the language used within those regulations, how prescriptive are they, for instance, and looking at where regulations or acts are superseded, what parts of those end up in other instruments. So it's and yeah, bringing that kind of time lens is potentially, really valuable, but it would be helpful, I guess, to understand the use case a lot more too as we do that.
Thank you. We have quite a few other questions on what does it include and what does it not include. So I'll try and run through those quickly. You can perhaps say yes, no. Awards and industrial agreements, are they included?
No.
No. Supreme Court decisions and NCAT decisions, i.e., things that become case law.
Not yet, but this is something I'm very interested in looking at. I think I won't go into the data science of it, but because of the range of precedents that exist in case law, I think there's a lot of scope for some quite interesting calculations that can be put over that as well, that would help drill into, look, what are the most referenced other cases? What are the pieces of legislation most referenced in cases? That kind of thing. So I think that is something I'm keen to look at.
Right. Andrew Milliken has put his hand up, so I'm assuming that may mean he has a question for us.
Yeah, so I'm not opposed to the Crown Solicitor's reference. One of the things I find, like I work in the data governance space within Transport in New South Wales, one of the things we find fascinating is it's challenging for the organisation to look at is when there's case law precedents or advice from the Crown Solicitor's Office that changes the definitions of things, having a tool that can be able to search through or even highlight to internal stakeholders what that means in practice. So like the Crown Solicitor advice in relation to I think FMM in relation to iCare has changed the definition of what is data, like is data disclosure breaches. Then that sort of, even just an ability to do push notifications would be quite useful for certain things. So the ability to be able to do an interest in what a particular department or particular division is interested in needs to be across, and then some sort of push notification to say this has changed, or this is, there's two pieces of case law that have changed, or say mandatory data breach notification comes in on 28th of November, Ombudsman Act changes on the 1st of October. There's a whole lot of new Commonwealth legislation that's coming in the next few months that has an impact on the state as well. So it's all that sort of stuff. Some sort of push notification, even just direct people to look at stuff. I think it'd be very useful to minimise a lot of the risk in the space. And thanks for that. Just a bit of feedback. So.
No, thank you. I think that those are really good suggestions. Those are certainly things I think we can look at. I think
This is
part of our experience has been it. As we look at where else we can go with that, firstly, it's been fascinating. We do data science. This isn't our natural world. It's been fascinating to realize just how broadly this can potentially extend to. I think the other thing is sometimes the suggestions call out the real challenges in actually locating a definitive source of the information. This is one of the, I guess, solving this is potentially one of the benefits of the tool.
Yeah, we're getting some really interesting feedback, I think, on potential future directions. I wanted to ask a little bit more about how it was developed and the thinking behind it. Matthew, can you talk about the process? I know you also, is probably a secondary question. Maybe I'll ask, I'll hold the second thought for a minute. Yes, tell us a little bit more about how it was developed.
So there were a few pieces. This project was a little unusual for us in that typically we're working with agencies around a very defined problem. This one had a few sources of inspiration, but we started developing the tool really drawing on some other, I guess, technical elements, more or less independently. And then as we started to put it together, we reached out to particularly some other parts of DCS to engage them and get their feedback on, look, does this seem useful? What else do we need to put into this to make it helpful? So it's been a fairly organic process. The feedback we've got has consistently been, yes, this is useful and could be made much more so. So we've been fairly iteratively, improving those changes as and when we can.
Yeah, and I have to ask, why is it called legislation twin?
So I don't. There's an element of branding in this. I will acknowledge, but and I would say from a technical point of view, the twin is a little bit aspirational here, but a digital twin is a term that's come out over the last few years, really, and what it means is a virtual representation of a system over time that's updated from real-time data and can simulate events. So simulate changes in the system. So you'll hear about, for instance, the New South Wales spatial digital twin, which is really trying to bring all of the data you might have about a location, everything about, the standard kind of things you would map, but also bringing in data on the buildings. So you get that third dimension, and then trying to look at that over time, which is the fourth dimension. And particularly the private sector is using this. For instance, manufacturing is an easy example where you say, okay, we've got our manufacturing process from woe to go. We model that. We have data coming in to say, look, this is where we are at every stage of the process. And we can see that, okay, if we do more of this, what happens? We can simulate it. Now, we're obviously not doing that simulation here, certainly not yet. But what it is doing is starting to give you build out that picture in a way that lets you show, look, these are the interconnections between things.
Okay, so it seems like that also is, apart from expanding the scope of the underlying data sources, that's potentially another future direction that it will, enable policy when policy is being developed, or policy to change legislation, that there can be essentially a kind of sandbox where we can potentially see the impact of, if we make a change to this piece of legislation or a definition here, what is the flow and consequence for that? Is that how you're thinking that it will be used?
Yes, and there's an element of that already, in that if I can see how a piece of legislation is referenced by other pieces of legislation or regulations, then it makes it easier for me to see, well, potentially if I make changes here, where might there be an impact? Similarly, with the definitions tab, what that will do is, if I look up the definition for child, it'll show me there are 53 acts that have a definition for child, and it will explicitly call out, okay, here are 2 acts where the definition for child references the definition for child in another act. And then I can press a button and it will draw a box around all of the definitions for child that have exactly the same text. So the Anatomy Act and the Human Tissue Act both have exactly the same definition for child, which is a person who is under 18 and not married, which is different from all of the other definitions of child. So again, you can look at, well, where are the consistencies? If I make changes to a definition in this act, will that flow through to the definitions in another act? Will it introduce inconsistencies because, well, there's no explicit link, but at the moment it's got the same definition as these 2 other acts, and if I change it, it won't? Does that matter? Well, maybe it does and maybe it doesn't, but it makes it much easier to see that.
Thank you. We now have a question. I'm hoping the audience member who has posted that question will pop in and ask their question themselves, so we can meet them. A heads up, it's about metadata New South Wales.
Yeah, that's Andrew again from Transport. Yeah, so there's I think it's a pending project that Community Justice is looking at doing it, which is metadata New South Wales, which I think is being raised. A lot of the stuff looks like it could, there'd be a lot of, I think, potential crossover in that space, because you're essentially creating metadata in relation to reference legislation. It'd be a really good add-on to be able to link it to the actual sets themselves, or the standards in that space. So yeah, it looks very cool. Lots of potential.
Yes, it's a really interesting analogy. There are some similarities really in the kinds of functionality we're putting together here, but let's say without the depth of a Calibra or an Elation.
Yeah, familiar with both tools. I agree.
For those not informed about metadata, Matthew, could you go into a bit more detail about some of those other
Sorry,
tools
yes.
or initiatives? Yeah.
So metadata being, if you like, data about the data. So that can be a range of things. It can be, this field is text, this field is a date, this field is a number. This is the range of values within the data, and obviously, ideally definitions. So it can build up to become quite a rich picture. So within the data space, ideally, this is something that's getting a lot more attention. It is about, ultimately, it's about taking the knowledge out of people's heads, because they work with the data every day and they know all these things, and making it accessible to other users. I did see a question come up about how it's accessible. And this is perhaps one of my problems this morning, but it is in fact publicly accessible. So I'll share the link if people haven't found it already in the chat. But yes, it's actually on the internet. So I mean, as I say, it wasn't really our aim that this is, okay, here's a tool for the public. It's really, from our point of view, primarily our audience is, public servants. But the easiest way to make it accessible to public servants across government is to make it open. And of course, all the data is open data.
I wanted to ask more about the data and how you mentioned earlier ChatGPT and maybe text-based analysis. Can you tell us a little bit more about the DAC's involvement in those types of tools? I think it's incredibly interesting for policy professionals. Probably has very wide-ranging potential and implications for policy professionals, the ability to analyse text-based material. I was wondering about your views on that and the future.
It's certainly going to have very big impact. We've been having discussions with a number of agencies about the use cases they're seeing. I think one of the things that's certainly I've been finding, I think it's a common experience, is that this capabilities come on so quickly that it's quite challenging to think through of where this might go. One of the reasons for us to pick up this project is precisely because it is a safe use case for us, because it is open data. And there's some other instances we've been able to do this as well. I guess there's a whole range of large language models and generative AI. Some of those models are things that can be brought within our infrastructure and our ecosystem, so that there is no question, for example, of the data that's being used going outside and back to being used to train a model, and indirectly becoming discoverable potentially to other areas. Some of these models, the open ones, that is still manageable, but it becomes something that you do have to much more consciously manage. And of course, there are still sovereignty issues as well in terms of the data centers that are available for this. Still, that's changing quite quickly, but still being overseas. That's not necessarily a complete blocker, but again, it just raises the level of thinking that needs to go into deciding to use these models. So what we'll see over time is the arrangements for, well, how should you use these models, under what circumstances, will become a lot clearer. And what we'll start to see, I'm sure, is that there are department-specific setups such that the material that's being referenced is internal. So that, for instance, we'll start to see, better intranet search engines. We'll start to see tools potentially that help us compare different policy documents and identify contradictions. So this policy says something should happen in 20 days. Another one or another document on our website says this should happen in 30 days. We've been exploring the use of ChatGPT with the social media teams to look at, help them respond and understand comments to government posts on social media. And what we see there is, look, it's very easy to use the tool to generate a summary of, okay, summarize. We had 200 responses to a post about koalas. Give me a 100-word summary of what those posts were saying. And again, this is something to proofread, something to use, not use unquestioningly, but it will certainly make that kind of work much easier.
That sounds fascinating. Very exciting. I think there are some issues that we'll have to work through, and we might look at running another session on the use of AI in policy work. So please get in contact with me, anyone who would like to hear further about that one. There's a question, I think, from Armando. If you'd like to come on, I know you've had your hand up.
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Hi, Matthew. My name's Armando. I'm with Liquor and Gaming. So this is sort of related to what you were just speaking about. I understand that and I've used the tool a bit already, so it's great. Good work. I understand that the new search function that came online just a few weeks ago now has, I guess, natural language search functionality. I've used it a bit. Obviously, I guess the site's probably being overused right now. So one thing I was hoping to get out of this was just some maybe suggestions or examples of how to use that natural language search function. I've used it a couple of times, and obviously it gives huge ranges of answers. And so I was looking for some advice about maybe how best to use that functionality.
Yeah. So we refer to that as semantic search, which is to say that it is trying to search on meaning. And what it uses is a process called embedding, which means that, not to get mathematical, but individual words are given a number in a, I'm going to use the phrase multi-dimensional space, based on the content, the words around them. And you do that over millions and billions of times to get a sense of, look, this is the context in which the word is used. And words that have a similar score, if you like, tend to be more synonymous. So what it's doing is, when we search for powers of entry, it's looking for other words and phrases that are used in the same way to try and get at, look, we're trying to search for the underlying meaning here rather than the specific text. It's a little bit like the way Google searches work. The distinction, I guess, of putting it into this tool is that it means that we avoid duplications, which often come up with a Google search, and it's only referencing the tool. Sorry, it's only referencing the legislation rather than the whole internet. I think it is, again, it's not it's the same way as exact text searches are not perfect. It does mean you want to try a few different things to see, look, is this adding anything new to the searches I've already got? And it's worth looking at trying to use it in combination with some of the other search functionality. So potentially, excluding results that include a word, for instance. But it, I know I've personally found some challenges. We had a question the other day about, look, can we use this to identify all the delegations? What are the relevant acts that set out delegations? And I haven't got to the bottom of it yet either, but what I found is, well, yes, but it's also going to include, things that aren't relevant to this question of, look, what are the the departmental delegations. It'll include some other things as well. And potentially, if I refine the search a bit more, I'll be able to exclude those. So yeah, I think it's a useful function, but yeah, it is still as ever a bit of a, use with care rather than taking the results as being, yes, this is the complete and total answer.
Thank you. We have a question from Claire now. Claire, would you like to come on and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, thank you. My name is Claire. I work in the Ministry of Health on sort of tobacco and e-cigarette issues. This tool is really great, so I was really excited to see it. I had a very quick look at it and saw that as well as the diagrams of sort of cross references, then you could export a table that had that underlying data in the sections and so forth. In the policy area that I work in, there's a lot of cross-referencing that's incredibly important to Commonwealth acts. So is there a way that if we sort of manually summarize some of that key stuff ourselves, that we could, add that into, say, the CSV and then map it somehow if we wanted to create a diagram that kind of built on it? So I'm not a software person, so like I don't know if programs like Visio do it or anything like that, but yeah, is there a way that we can kind of build on what you've got if we need to add a few extra things in that aren't available at this time?
That's a really good question. I don't have an answer to it. I think Visio is a good thought. I think that's something we might have a go at, just to see if we can do that. It sounds like it should be really relatively simple. The tool, yeah, I mean, certainly the tool itself, or the visualization itself we've built here, is built in a tool called Plotly Dash, which is a code-driven tool. So it's on the bright side, it's very customizable, but on the downside, it means you have to customize everything. But look, I think that's something we'll have a little play with and potentially add to the guide as well, because I think that's a useful adjunct to it. I don't think we'll ever be able to include everything that everyone might want to, just because of the potential range of things.
I do love that idea, though, of putting tools into the hands, maybe it's dangerous, tools into the hands of policy professionals, so that because everyone has, a unique policy issue that they're dealing with, and also that expertise that you mentioned, Matthew, being in people's heads, but with that expertise in people's heads, we can do quite wonderful things already. But having some additional tools at our disposal, whether that's AI or other customised things, then customisable things, then I think we could also see some really fantastic innovation in the sector as well. We have a last question from Sonia. Sonia, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Hi there. Great tool, thank you. I'm from the Office of Local Government. I was just wondering if you're aware of any other jurisdictions that have a similar tool. I've done a bit of a Google search, but haven't been able to find anything.
There aren't, and in fact, we haven't seen anything else like this at all.
Wow.
I guess what I'd say about that is, firstly, we've certainly shared this with our counterparts in Victoria and suggested that this is potentially something they could pick up, and we've shared it with a couple of areas of Commonwealth, and including the Australian Law Reform Commission. So I think, I think it's something that will come. I guess more broadly, just to clarify the novelty of it, there is a rich, I guess, commercial landscape of legal tools, certainly some of which have at least some of this functionality, and generally speaking, quite a lot more functionality. Their orientation is rather different, I think. From what I've seen, it tends to be targeted at legal professionals, and it's very much more specific in that respect. Or it's targeted at the corporate market and helping them understand what, from a compliance point of view, what is the world I have to comply with. So the emphasis is a bit different, though there is a counterpart which we have been asked for, which this is an outstanding question for us as well, which is, it's great to see the ministerial allocations, but if I'm running an agency, so if I'm running the State Insurance Regulatory Authority or Revenue New South Wales, what pieces of legislation am I responsible for? And this is another one of those questions where it's difficult to answer, and it's difficult to answer not in the specific, because often with these things, if you have a specific question, then it's relatively easy to find an answer, but if you want to say, okay, but we want to answer that for everything, which agency is, what's the agency allocation for all the acts? At the Commonwealth level, that's much simpler. They actually specifically set that out. For New South Wales, that clarity is, well, it may exist, but it doesn't appear to be centrally documented.
I think
I'd love to be proved wrong.
I think we document that when ministers start in their roles and hand over the book. Dear Minister, here's all the things you are now responsible for. But as you point out, not a central
yes,
or perhaps efficient process.
My impression of it is that it's a bit like the budget. It's the same as it was last year, except for how we've changed it.
Indeed. Now, I'd like to thank Dr. Matthew Roberts for presenting to us today. It's been an interesting discussion, and there've been heaps of suggestions on how to improve the tool in the future. So we'll make sure that they're available to the Data Analytics Centre, and I also wanted to thank our audience for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. We have a pretty regulatory heavy program ahead of us, actually, and I thought I will just give a quick plug to some of those upcoming webinars. So we have another webinar on the 19th of September with Philip Crawford, who's the Chief Commissioner of the New South Wales Independent Casino Commission, who's talking about the challenges with casino regulation. We'll also have a presentation from Parliamentary Counsel's Office about the development of legislation, and then in November we have William Murphy talking about the new role of the Cabinet Office. So really great program coming up, and hope that you will be able to join us then for that. Until then, take care. Thank you.
Thank you.